This session is entitled, Show Me the Money. And we're going to have a slightly different format for this session. We have two presenters, and we're going to sort of break up the usual way that one speaks and then a group responds. We're going to have a conversation, but we'll have 20 minutes of conversation with you. So be thinking about the serious questions you want to consider. And just as a forewarning, we're also going to break up the format just a little bit. When we turn it over to questions for the audience, we're going to pause and have conversations at your table for just a couple of minutes for the ideas that you've heard and what really stuck out and what's significant and what is it you want to know more about, or where is the stuck issue here, so that in fact there's going to be a little structured reflective pause in there for you to talk with your table mates, and then we'll bring those ideas back for our two presenters to address. So here are our two presenters. Let me bring them out while I introduce them. We have Jesse Rosen and Holly Sidford. Come on out. And I have a short introduction for each of them. This would be the applause moment. Jesse Rosen is the president and CEO of the League of American Orchestra since 2008. He's been a leading voice for change, empowering the League's 800-member orchestras with knowledge, perspective to navigate their own paths in a rapidly changing environment. Under his leadership, the League has advocated for orchestras' reinvigoration and deeper engagement with community, greater discipline and understanding of fiscal health, increased use of data to inform decision-making, and widespread engagement with composers. Jesse's given voice to America's orchestras through his Huffington Post blog, Symphony Magazine column, national media interviews, international appearances, and Jesse serves on the board of the American Composers Orchestra as vice chair of the Performing Arts Alliance and on the board of overseers for Curtis Institute of Music. And Holly is the president of Helicon Collaborative, a national consulting firm that works with artists, cultural organizations and foundations and other enterprises to make communities better places for all people, more vital, adaptive, and just. Holly has more than 25 years of experience leading cultural and philanthropic organizations and is nationally recognized for her work in expanding access to arts and culture, enhancing support for artists, and building organizational strategic capacity. Before starting Helicon, Holly was the founding president of Leveraging Investments in Creativity, LINC, which I can say from my own experience was one of those truly powerful contributions to my work in the arts, actually permanently changed the understandings in the field. And that was a 10-year initiative to improve support systems for artists. She has held leadership positions at the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Fund, at the Ford Foundation, the Howard Gilman Foundation, and New England Foundation for the Arts. So we're going to start with a little presentation from Holly, sort of setting the stage for us. We're going to have a conversation up here, and then we're going to open it up to you. Holly.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks for that very nice introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first SphinxCon, but it won't be my last. It's very energetic and informative group. About 4 years ago, I was asked by an organization called the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy to take a look at funding patterns in the arts, and particularly the patterns relative to organizations of color and organizations serving communities that were low income or marginalized in one way or another. I published a report from that 3 years ago, which is still available online if you'd like. And that was a life-changing experience for me, I have to say. I have been in this field my entire life. I have known and worked on issues of diversity and inequity for most of that time. I know in my bones that things aren't fair, and most of the people I talk to every day know things aren't fair, but looking at the data was absolutely stunning. And I've tracked it since. So what I'm going to share with you today is a few highlights from a much larger data set, and we can get into it over time. But I want to say something about data in the arts, which is that as much effort has gone into improving our data in the last few years with CDP and National Center on Arts Research and such, we still are Our taxonomies don't agree. Our data is incomplete. We especially have almost no data about artists as far as funding is concerned. And so we're still struggling with the accuracy and the nuance that data can provide. But I wanted to share what we have so far. So let's see if I can do this right. First, about the distribution of groups. Here's where this disagreement about taxonomies comes right to the fore. The IRS says that there are 104,000 nonprofit cultural organizations operating in the United States. The National Center on Arts Research says that there's something like 55,000 who reported activity between 2007 and 2012. The National Center on Charitable Statistics, which is the most detailed and accurate entity, looking at 990s, says that there are about 40,000 organizations operating with more than $25,000 a year, therefore have to file 990s. So anyway, the universe is maybe contestable, but this is the distribution of groups according to NCAR. And I think this is quite interesting because if you look at the distribution, you see that community organizations and theaters are two of the largest segments of organizations in our sector. NCAR defines community arts organizations to include multi-purpose organizations, cultural and ethnic organizations, folk artists, and community celebrations, things that are really aiming at the ground. Our economy as a whole is about $31 billion. If you take all 55 or 40,000, depending on how you cut it. This is actually from the NCCS data, which is the $40,000 number, says that we have about a $31 billion economy. And the sources of support for that economy include individual givers, individual donors, public sources, foundations and other organized philanthropy, and then a whole variety of other revenue sources, ticket sales, gifts, investment income, et cetera. So really an important point to remember, and I know you all do know it every day, is that foundations are actually a relatively small portion of the contribution to the arts economy. Individuals and other sources of revenue are much, much larger. Just a few other relevant data. The information about giving in the arts by foundations is largely from the Foundation Center, which only tracks grants over $10,000. So it only tracks in detail about half of the total contributions. It's about $4 billion a year. So the Foundation Center's data tracks in detail about $2 billion. About 10% of giving overall, all foundation giving, goes to the arts. And that is down from the high of about 13% in 2004, 2005. It's bumped along between 13 and 11% for some years, but the 10% number is actually a dip in 2012. Public sources have actually increased in recent years, but if you compare what is the current allocation of federal, state, and local public sources, they actually equate to inflation-adjusted dollars, what was being allocated in 1994. So public funding really hasn't increased in 20 years. Even though the absolute numbers are greater, the value is not as much. And we all know that smaller organizations, for a variety of different reasons, are more dependent on public sources, in part because they can't access wealthy donors or foundations. This is a slide on the distribution of contributed income based on data from NCCS. This is 2012 data. And basically what this slide says is that 50% of the organizations, those 40,000 organizations, get 5% of the money, and 3% of the organizations get 60% of the money. In fact, it gets even worse because the data from NCCS says that 176 organizations, the very largest organizations, get 32% of all gifts, grants, and contributions allocated in 2012. These numbers really have not changed in the last 3 or 4 years.
This coverage of SphinxCon is made possible by the Dte Energy Foundation and its ongoing commitment to diversity. DTE is dedicated to strengthening the fabric of the community and providing support for local cultural organizations and educators.
Every discipline, and large organizations in every discipline. But I think that there is a strong correlation between the more community-oriented organizations, more ethnic, minority-run organizations, and size, and they tend to be smaller. And to anticipate a question, I think that some people, in response to my original report, and this is a debate Jesse and I have continuously, so I'm sure he'll respond, but that the larger organizations, if you pick an individual organization, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Chicago Symphony, they're reaching more people than your average community-based organization in a given day, on a given year, for example. But if you do just sort of rough back of the envelope calculations, the groups that are over $5 million a year, of which there are about 2,300, if we estimated that they reach, say, 200,000 people a year, some reach more, some reach less, let's average that. That would suggest that they're touching 465 million individuals, or anyway, people coming through their doors. And if you look at the groups under 5 million, which total close to 38,000, and give them the estimate that they're reaching, say, 20,000 a year, the number of people that they reach, it totes to 755 million. My point is that in aggregate, the smaller organizations, because there are so many of them, even though each one individually is reaching fewer than the biggest institutions, actually reach a much broader spectrum of people. So the implications of this for me are that the arts funding is imbalanced relative to the evolving cultural sector and to our changing demographics, and that if we all agree that art is essential to a creative life and healthy communities, we must address this imbalance. And that funders and cultural groups of all kinds, they're very diverse in purpose, but everyone has a role to play in contributing to greater equity. And in conclusion, I just want to say, this data, as I said before, I kind of had it in my back of my mind, but when I actually looked at this data 4 years ago and continue to track it, it's very difficult to absorb. It produces either rage or defensiveness. It's hard not to have a strong reaction to these numbers. But I think that a lot of progress is actually being made, and we have to get beyond that rage or that defensiveness and really engage in conversation about what is working, what can change, how do we all contribute to this, and how can we make these numbers adjust over time going forward.
Thanks. Jesse, rage or defensiveness?
I promised lots of both. Actually, just to start out to say how great it is to be here, and the experience of SphinxCon is just so extraordinary. And this morning I loved hearing from Rachel from ABT, and what an inspiring piece of work they're doing. And my table mates from Flint, Michigan were great conversationalists and wonderful to meet. And Francisco Nunez, my 11-year-old son, sings in his chorus. And I'm here to tell you everything he said is really true. And that chorus is completely mixed. It's kids from the city, kids from the suburbs, rich, poor, in between, all kinds of colors. And it's a great combination of both that mix and also wonderful discipline from Francisco, not just about making music, but also respect for the music, respect for one another, respect for the discipline of the art form. And my kid got in. They only took 5 kids this year, and he was one of 5, so I was really happy. And so I just want to actually thank SphinxCon, who I think are demonstrating great convening chops, and big salute to Aaron and his team for getting us all altogether. So on to the defensiveness and rage. I think that the data that Holly has shared is really, really helpful and an essential part of our beginning to understand questions of equity in the arts and in arts funding. I do, however, tend to think of the data that we've seen so far as kind of a blunt proxy for understanding this question, really. And I think this because of a few reasons. One is I never thought equity meant everybody gets the same, or everyone gets some proportionate share. I think of equity having much more to do with issues of fairness and access. Also, the obvious question of scale. If you are owning and operating a building, if you are supporting large numbers of performing artists at living wages with benefits for health and pension, you have large expenditures. But the biggest reason why I get a little uncomfortable with some of that data in the way it's presented, and maybe it was in the word on Holly's last slide about this being a balance question, which makes it sound like when you think of balancing, you think a little bit of taking from one to give to the other. And I think that would be the worst way to think about this, as some kind of a zero-sum game. And I'd like to think that each of us, from whatever arts disciplines and genres we're involved in, believes that we have a stake in one another's success. And so it's really not particularly helpful to think that this is a balancing question. I don't think any of us would advocate for less money to one part of the arts sector so that the other could have more, any more than any of us would get up in front of our legislatures and say, we need more arts money, so please take it away from health and education and social services. This, for me, is a question of how we together as working as a unified arts community can address questions of equity in arts funding. And that may sound, like we're all a big one happy family and everything's just fine and there are no problems with that. But I want to relate a story that indicates to me that as a community, we're not quite there in being able to function together around questions of equity. And this will take a little bit of time to tell, but not too long. As Eric said, I'm a member of the Performing Arts Alliance, and this is a C4 advocating for the performing arts in Washington before our federal legislatures. Many of you in the room are involved with it on it. And recently it's taken on a wider scope beyond federal advocacy and has been working a lot on questions of diversity, equity, inclusion, et cetera, et cetera. And we had a meeting not so long ago from a national funder wanting to talk to us in order to introduce a new program of support for the arts. And the representative indicated that this support was going to be for opera, symphony, dance, theater, and presenting. And the Performing Arts Alliance is way bigger than that. And so we have, Fractured Atlas and NPN, Alternate Roots, all kinds of groups. And so MK from NPN asked the question of the funder, how about us? Are we going to get some too? And the answer was no. And everyone was a little uncomfortable in the room. And then the conversation just kind of moved on. And I've been thinking about this, and what a weird, strange experience this was, that following that real-time question of equity and distribution across different types of art genres and disciplines, here we were, the Performing Arts Alliance, with no capacity to actually have the conversation about what just took place. And what would our collective view be about this kind of a funding decision being made? And there was never any conversation about it. And as I thought about it, well, gosh, there could have been so many different things we thought about or proposed. We could have said, well, as the Performing Arts Alliance, we'd like to suggest to the funder, maybe you'd like to consider X, Y, and Z. I mean, there's so many possibilities, but we didn't have the capacity to have the conversation. And I think I'm going to stop here in a second just to indicate that I think at some point this afternoon, I want to share with you what the Performing Arts Alliance is subsequently trying to do around how it addresses questions of diversity and equity and inclusion in the arts. Is that a good place to stop?
That's a good, in fact, I want to throw a question to both of you. And this is mostly to help inform the conversations that are going to happen at the table in a minute. Can you identify places where you think you and Holly agree and disagree around this issue? To really just help us focus on where the real leverage points, the key points that produce anger or defensiveness, where they live.
Well, I think we would both agree very strenuously that there isn't enough money or support for the arts, not just money, but public support and will for the arts, and that's the fundamental issue. And I think actually, even though we've never talked about this, I bet we would agree with Maria Jackson and to a certain extent Jamie last night, in that the arts community needs to see its sphere of influence and its community larger than we currently do, that we need to get out of our silos by discipline, and even within the arts sector, and embrace a bigger role and responsibility for community change. So I know we agree on those things.
Totally, totally. You know, I would, just to build on what Holly just said, and this was in an earlier conversation today, but I think, you know, we're at a moment where aesthetically the boundaries between arts disciplines and genres are more porous than they've ever been. And this has been, you know, I think a hugely beneficial development for the arts and for audiences and people who engage in them. So I think the idea of fostering greater connectivity and engagement across our different types of arts organizations is, in fact, a great way to, you know, to make progress on this. And I think we probably would agree about that too.
So, no disagreements.
You asked about agreements. I'll go
mean,
with the disagreements if you want to.
I mean, it's clear that, in fact, it's scarcity of resources and the fact that it seems like a zero-sum game that turns on the inequity and the rage and defensiveness. So it's the fact that we're all have scarcity thinking and scarcity history, and the fact it seems a closed pool is what exacerbates the tensions here. And in fact, a lot of agreement around once that starts to open and a more collaborative, collective thinking about how to raise the level of all boats actually takes a lot of pressure off the issue. Jesse, you had a question.
But could I say, it's not all kumbaya, because there are lots of other issues at play here, and it's not just, I mean, there are racial prejudices and biases and structural racism that impedes progress. There are class issues that impede progress. There are issues of not really recognizing the deep patterns that have built up not only our cultural sector, but also our philanthropic sector. I mean, as I said in my original report, the philanthropic development in the arts, unlike philanthropy and other fields, was not predicated on addressing social ills and improving communities. It was to both fortify and in certain cases protect the elites in 19th century, early 20th century communities, and to hold up the Western European canon as the great art. So, I mean, it's a little more, it's got more grit in there than...
I'm glad we're there.
Well, you know, one of the places, you know, where I think there's a lot of opportunity to do things better is in partnering. And I mean, I've had experience running a small arts organization, trying to work with a very, very large organization. And the big-small dynamic also has in it some of the issues Holly just referenced. And I don't think this is a highly functional part of our ecology yet, the way big and small work together, and particularly some of our larger canonic organizations working with communities, an area of emerging practice. And I think the more recent tradition had been that we have something to make available to you and help us deliver it. And I think that we're moving much more toward some notion of co-creation and authentic, genuine partnerships. It comes from some real artistic shared goal and shared need. And when we get to the end of today, we're going to show a little video to give an illustration of big and small, of canonic and, in this case, Native American artists working together.
Jesse, you had a question that we thought we might offer the tables to chew on for a few minutes before we begin a dialogue with the audience.
Sure. Well, I mean, this is a question that we've actually posed to one another at the Performing Arts Alliance, almost as a rhetorical question to open up a bigger conversation about our own views of equity. And it's a question, it's not a necessarily to-do question, it's like a thought experiment. But if all of us across our different art forms and genres were to speak with one voice to the funding community, what would we say?
Let's turn that over to your tables. If we were to speak, we heard it from Francisco this morning, how do we educate funders about what we know? If across the field were to speak to with one voice to funders addressing issues of fairness and equity, what would we say? See if that works for you as a table conversation, or if not, find another conversation that is useful, and we'll check in just a couple of minutes. Just a minute or so, just another minute or two. And would you just bring those to a close? Bring just those conversations to a close. And as appropriate and respectful as it would be to take some time just now and hear from the different groups about observations, things that came up, things that are particularly pertinent to the different tables, rather than having a report of different kinds, I want to direct you to make use of these resources we've got. So do you have a question that came up in your conversation for which they may have an answer based on the depth of their experience? Is there a question based on this issue that is relevant to every person in the room that came up at your table that has a question or a challenge or an idea for these two resources we have? Yes, a question right here. We have a mic coming and ask you to stand. And for those of you who are new arrivals, we are being streamed live, so please know that your observations have a much wider ripple effect. Please, identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Rachel De Guzman, and I have an organization called 21st Century Arts, and one of the things that we're doing is convening a lot of conversations around Greater Rochester. It's a very strong arts community with a lot of poverty. So one of the things that occurs to me when you're talking about equity and resources, I was trying to have an analogy from my perspective that wasn't as contentious nowadays. At one time, women weren't on stage. In theater, it was only men. When that transition happened and women became part of theater, it may have meant that some men wouldn't have all the roles. I want to then fast forward to now. So it may not be about taking something away from people that already have, but I think we've already gone through transitions in the history of the world where when you're more inclusive, then we've been able to get over it. How do we have that conversation now with equity? Another thing about Rochester that I want to add, we have county funding of $1.3 million, which is really terrible. But 900,000 of that goes to one institution. Mm-hmm. How do we address that without it becoming taking away an affirmative action or an inclusion argument, and maybe also look at the preference side of that? Great.
Well, I have to say, I'm a socialist. I do believe in just redistributing the wealth. Let me just say that. But two thoughts. One is, it goes back to the idea of expanding the definition. If it's one institution against everybody else, or one institution representing the arts in the eyes of a lot of people and nobody else being seen, that picture has to change. The definition of what we're about has to expand. And to me, this relates to another obsession of mine, which is that I think we've become so focused on institutions in our sector, the 40,000, the 55,000, whatever, that we forgot about the function. What's the function we're playing? What's the function of art? I mean, I think personally that we're almost in an emergency situation in this country. If you just look at what's happening with criminal justice system and income inequality. I mean, these are really serious issues. We need to build empathy. We need to build a bigger sense of humanity and what we're about. And it seems to me the arts have we're critical to that. We're critical to reviving those capacities in our communities. And that's not a very direct answer to your question, except that I think we have to take the question a little larger and say, what is it that we're really trying to affect here? And then how can we all, multiple people and multiple institutions, get behind that goal?
So I can one-up Holly. I'm the son of two communist parents. And they were communists at a time where being a communist in America meant you didn't ever say it out loud. So I won't say out loud what my own political beliefs are, but I do think that painting large institutions and canonic institutions with a broad brush as organizations that are not concerned with and not part of the solutions around equity and participation and diversity would be a big mistake. And I don't say this because I believe that they are all doing everything that they can, or that they are all, on board and putting all energy in that direction, but many of them are, and they do command resource, they do command reach to many audiences and many artists, and I think working with them has to be part of any strategy to, address these issues. I just cannot see it in any way to think about this practically without bringing us all together.
It's one way of saying that direct opposition is no win?
Yeah.
Okay. Questions? Yes, in the corner?
Akandayo Bandeli with Hattie Lou Theater, Black Repertory in Memphis, Tennessee. So we were discussing about, at our table, how would we approach funders and diversifying what they give to organizations across the board. And one of the things that I brought up when you interrupted, we started to get into a wonderful conversation about it. You broke us up. But what I brought up to the table for discussion was asking funders to strengthen culturally specific organizations. Because we are all nonprofits, which means we exist for our mission. And Memphis is in the South, and if you have an organization that its mission is to spotlight the achievements of the Confederacy, then asking them to become culturally diverse, that's kind of not really mission focused. However, if you have a Black repertory, you have a Black dance company, or you have a Hispanic theater, or something like that, and larger institutions can collaborate with them, that in itself is inclusivity. That in itself is bringing different audiences. It's rising tide lifts all boats, which is what we're talking about. However, the smaller culturally specific organizations are not receiving funding that are enabling them to grow. And when you write a grant and you're putting your data there and you're putting your program there and you have a strong balance sheet and you've never been in the red and you're still passed over, because you're seen as catering to a small demographic within your community, while this museum or this other structure, they are serving a greater population. And so the culturally specific organization is left to founder and eventually dissipate and disappear, and 20 years later, we're right back where we are at SphinxCon saying, how can we be diverse? And so I think if foundations could look at those small culturally specific organizations that can just need a little help to break that sound barrier, that in itself will lead us toward more diversity.
What do you think?
I agree, but I think that your point, which is really well taken, raises another one for me, which is there's power in numbers. We live in a very competitive system. I mean, we are in a hyper-capitalized, society, and don't get me started on that. But in the place where you live, there are probably many organizations, small organizations, serving a variety of different kinds of populations, particular neighborhoods. Do you get together? Do you share the information about who you're serving? Do you go to the funders together and say, my organization may only serve 5,000 people, but together with these other 10, we serve 75,000 or 100,000 people. Not that it's all in numbers, but the point is that when you're small, you have to, think of yourselves as David and use some unfamiliar approaches to get into the conversation. So I don't know if I'm being clear, but the point is that you have to think about your collective power and your collective opportunity to talk to funders. I think that might have some success. Jesse?
That's all?
I totally agree with everything Holly just said.
You may not believe it, but we have only one more minute before we're going to go to your film. So it seems like a really short time, so you can be angry and I can be defensive. But for you two, any last closing thoughts, things that must be said?
I'm really inspired by a man named Manuel Pastor, who is a demographer at the University of Southern California. I really encourage you all to look at his work. It's great. And he uses a phrase which I think is really important. He says, keep pitching to the coming America. And I think that is really relevant for all of us, that we all need to anticipate what's coming, and we all need to be thinking about our role in engaging that future. And just because I didn't say it at the beginning, and I really meant to, you all should also check out Fractured Atlas. I've very happily been elected chair of the board of Fractured Atlas recently, and I think that it has services for all of you in this room and other artists around the country. So thank you.
Yeah. Jesse, any thoughts?
I guess I would just say let the artist lead, and there are, in this room, some extraordinary performers who I think exemplify, where America is going in the way in which they bring together not just people, but they start with the art, and art that is of our time, of our place, that is connective, and I think as institutional people, I think a big part of our job is to give support and energy to those artists and give them the runway they need to help us solve these problems.
Do you want to set up our, oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, and actually, for those of you who are interested, I mentioned that original report is on my organization's website and on the National Committee of Responsive Philanthropy. But one of the things I'm going to do this year is to do an update on that report. And what I would really love to ask all of you is I'd love to hear from you about what you would like to see in a report in 2015, 2016. What is it that we need to know about the way funding is allocated nationally that would help change the conversation locally? And I really invite your questions, your thoughts, your suggestions. I could use all the help I can get. Thank you.
Thanks.
And my rebuttal to Holly's report appears in the Huffington Post archives and the GIA Reader archives. So on to the film.
Set up the film.
Okay,
what are we going to see?
So this is going to be a very brief video. This is a partnership between the Seattle Symphony and a number of Native American tribes in the Pacific Northwest. And they came together only to do one thing, and that was to create music together. And incidentally, the funding for this came, part of it came from the League through a program we run through the Anne and Gordon Getty Foundation that supported this. And all of the funding combined, half of it went to the Seattle Symphony, and the other half went to the Native American tribes who participated. But for me, it's a stunning example of kind of where America is going and ways in which our organizations across very different genres and disciplines can work successfully together.
Jag är Ljustorps tidsdag. My name is Workman. Gualte Doftuabs Ishachad. I am of the Duwamish tribe. Aquayekwa si Alchad. I am great grandson of Chief Seattle. And so I would welcome you onto this land.
In my position with the symphony, it's important for me to help people to communicate with each other and for our musicians to communicate with other cultures and audiences. And this was an incredible opportunity to learn how to do that, which means not having all the answers and being willing to take risks.
Our goal at the outset was for it to be very balanced and very equal, with input from the tribal artists and the tribal musicians, and also from the symphony musicians and the more traditional Western composer. And I felt like we really accomplished that.
We've been here for a long time, and so to be recognized like this and to come into a hall and participate in this kind of a thing, this is a great thing. This is a wonderful thing.
My expectations were that it was going to be very challenging of me to walk gently and leave a huge amount of openness and space for an exchange, and that I was not going to push it or pull it anywhere. I was going to try to guide it very gently and as a collaboration wherever possible.
The thing that's most challenging is what's most challenging with almost all of the collaborations between non-native organizations and the tribes, and that is helping the organization understand some of the depth of tribal culture.
There were many different aspects of the project that we honestly didn't know in which direction they will go, but this is what made it very, very exciting.
At the Duwamish Longhouse, we had a cultural exchange. And we got to sit and have lunch and talk about many things, the different ways that we approach music. And my conclusion really was that all music is of a spiritual source.
Music has that ability to change relationships and transform relationships. That's one reason why I'm so excited to be a part of this.
That was basically the way we communicated in the beginning, and this is probably the most honest way of communication.
In just a short period of time, it's been amazing to see our new friends come into what they call the Longhouse and feel like it's their own.
I was curious what it will end up being. It was nothing like a traditional symphony that you get the score, you work on the details, and then you get with the musicians. It was much different than only music. The improvisation between the native musicians and our symphony musicians, we were creating it while we were rehearsing. Everybody brought what was on their hearts, and this is how this piece came to life.
When Paul started to play, I perked up and said, wow, this is very intense and very interesting and very musical. And I had never heard anybody play quite like that. The phrasing and the intonation, but especially the commitment in the playing was really very special. And that made me more drawn to my intensity and my participation.
Many of our elders have been quited through the years, and so it's very difficult for the kids of today to understand their heritage and who they are. But the pride that these kids had coming down the aisles was phenomenal. To look out and see that they make a difference.
It was a whole bunch of different tribes coming together, in addition to modern society, in a great big house, a great big house, full of sound. This is a very good thing.
It definitely broadened my way of seeing music, how it can unify us all as a community, because this is the perfect proof that it is possible and it is happening here in Seattle.
This music and collaboration is building bridges. We're letting go of things that have happened in the past.
And so Chief Seattle, he tried to bring people together. And so I think that's still true today. It's not just me and you or I, it's us. So I want to thank you, Thank you for your hard work.
And we're at the end of our session. A thank you to our two presenters.